Good evening. Welcome to this very special event, very special Salisbury Forum. I'm Sarah Tennyson, I'm President of the Salisbury Forum, and it's my great pleasure and honour to welcome you on behalf of the 6 local organisations that have collaborated to bring this event to you tonight. This is presented by us, the Salisbury Forum, together with the Salisbury Association, the Troutbeck Symposium, the Scoville Memorial Library and CT250. We would also like to thank the National Iron Bank for their generous sponsorship of this event. Russell Shorto's book Revolution Song has been the Salisbury Town Reads for some time now, and it's sparked a number of events locally, and there is still more to come. So while we always have wonderful speakers and wonderful, interesting events here, I have to confess to feeling slightly starstruck by tonight's lineup. And really to say that tonight's event is sort of the culmination of a number of things that have been happening here locally with students as well as with people like yourselves over the last 2 days while Russell Shorto has been in our area. So the book, I'm sure many of you have read it, and for those who haven't, I'm sure you'll be inspired by tonight's event. I feel like we're really entering conversations that have already been started and going on, and tonight's event really is a conversation between our 3 esteemed speakers here this evening. The book is a fascinating narrative history. There are so many themes that you could explore, so many threads that you could pull on, and so I'm really excited to see where we might go with that tonight. We're going to have about 45 to 50 minutes of conversation on the stage, and we will then open up to questions from you, the audience. So there will be a couple of people roving around with the handheld microphones. Please raise your hand if you have a question. And we do anticipate quite a lot of questions, so we encourage you where possible to be brief with that so we can get through as many as possible. So thank you. So, to welcome and introduce our 3 guests here tonight, we are thrilled to present to you Russell Shorto is the director of the new Amsterdam Project at the New York Historical Society and senior scholar at the new Netherland Institute. He is the author of 8 books of narrative history, including the best-selling The Island at the Centre of the World. His books have been published in 14 languages and have won numerous awards. In 2018, Russell was inducted into the New York State Writers Hall of Fame. Peter Vermilyea is an award-winning history educator and author. In fact, his latest book, Litchfield County in the Revolutionary War, is out next week. He teaches history right here at the high school and at the University of Connecticut. Rhonan Mokriski is co-founder of the Troutbeck Symposium. He's been teaching at his alma mater, Salisbury School, since 1996. For his dedication and innovative approach to teaching, he was named the 2024 Gilder Lehrman Connecticut History Teacher of the Year. Please join me in a warm, warm welcome to our speakers. Thank you.
Good evening. I want to begin by welcoming everybody to Housatonic Valley Regional High School, which has been my professional home for the last 31 years.
Put your mic closer.
Put closer, is that better? Does it work? Okay. Housatonic is a special place in a special community, and we're fortunate to have some really special days here, and today is really a great example of one of those special days. My United States history class had the privilege of a 90-minute master class in writing with Russell Shorto, and to that we're so grateful to Russell for his time. Thank you. We're so grateful to him for his time, and also, of course, to the 6 organizations that are sponsoring this event. And we had a little preview of the treat that we're all in for tonight. And so I'm going to turn it over to Rhonan to get things started.
Well, thank you for coming, everyone. And before we get started, not to add on to the intro, but
Let's give ourselves a round of applause, because I think it's pretty remarkable in this age of division where everything seems to be a fight, that we gathered together as a community to read a book. And I think that's really cool. It helped that the book was brilliant. And we were saying earlier, I haven't heard one complaint. I haven't even heard I liked it, but. So that might change that, we'll see. Most of us, I know, in town, we're reading the book as we were also watching Ken Burns' documentary. And I found like the connections just keep stopping me in my tracks. Margaret Moncrief, Washington, Burr, Howe, Clinton, they all made their appearances on screen, and I knew where they were from your book. And the dialogue between your narrative choices and the history just really, I thought, highlighted each other. So Revolution Song emphasizes the revolution as a lived human experience rather than individual political events or battles. Why did you choose these 6 individuals?
You mean these particular?
These particular 6, yeah. What personal stories moved you? Or?
Okay, well, I'll answer that, but first let me join in thanking you both, Pete and Rhonan, and Sarah and Karen, and all the people who were involved in putting this all together. And I want to echo the notion that in this divisive moment in history, the idea of getting everybody in a community, or everybody who's willing to do one thing together, to almost literally be on the same page, is very special. And the fact that it happens to be my book is even more special. So thanks for that. Okay, so I don't know. I could spend an hour trying to answer that question.
Why don't we do Margaret Moncrief? I know that's a personal favorite.
Okay, but I can't do that in isolation. I have to sort of say the overall concept was I didn't want to write a book about the American Revolution that told you what the American Revolution meant. I was interested in it as lived experience, and the idea was, if I could find a group of people, didn't have to be 6, from very different walks of life, and I wanted to start with the birth of the first of them and end with the death of the last, and just weave these stories together and see what happened. I mean, it was really an experiment, and I was curious what it would look like, because it's not a traditional method. What I normally do with narrative history is I find a story that is a conflict. You have 2 people or 2 sides in conflict, and then you build your story around that. So this, I mean, obviously there's a war that's a conflict, but as you know, if you read the book, it's not as simple as that. So how did I settle on these 6 people? I sort of auditioned dozens of people, and I had various criteria. I mean, I knew I had to have at least one of them who was African, one who was a Native American, at least one woman. The biggest challenge is that you work from primary sources, you work from actual records, and we have lots and lots of primary source material from the elites, from the white men in the powdered wigs. And very few well-documented people from marginalized groups, blacks or native. So that was a big hurdle. So I had to, I was limited by that. And there are cases where you have, you say somebody wrote a great diary, and there are a couple of women's diaries and I like the idea of, at one point, I thought it would be great to focus on a woman whose whole life transpires on a farm somewhere. And there were a couple of diaries that seemed to fit that bill, but they last for a couple of years. So, you know, that doesn't help me, because I want to be able to tell the story more or less from beginning to end. So, you know, it was like creating a puzzle and not knowing what the puzzle is going to look like, but having certain guidelines, and eventually, just by feel, you know, this finally feels right. And the last of them to fall into place was George Washington. I kind of resisted, but as soon as he was, that puzzle piece was in place, I felt like, oh, the whole thing fits now.
you talk about puzzle pieces, and as a narrative historian, I'm curious in how you know when you have enough pieces of the puzzle to responsibly, as a narrative historian, to responsibly tell that person's life. How do you know when you have enough?
I don't think I can, it's not a formula. As I say, I wanted to have lives that were documented more or less from beginning to end. I mean, if there are gaps, of course there are going to be gaps. Any history that you're doing is like connecting dots. In between the dots, you're just having to make inferences, or you're just skipping a few years, and you just have to live with that. So each of these people, ideally you've got a trove of letters or something like that. Someone like Abraham Yates is this shoemaker from Albany, New York, this street-level politician. Great writer of letters, and he was not only a shoemaker, he was a merchant. He dealt in a lot of products from the Caribbean. He sold rum and molasses, and his ledger is actually in the New York State Library. So I was actually working from his handwritten ledger. So when you have that kind of material, it's so rich. And then it's a matter of like, okay, going to other sources. What do I know? What do we know about his birth? And so for each of these 6 people, and this goes for any history that you're writing, there are people who are either, that's their job, there are, of course, Mount Vernon is a whole, the George Washington is an industry, but even for Venture Smith, for example, there we were talking about a couple of people who were real, I don't know if we didn't talk about Chandler Saint, but there are a couple of people who are, real Venture Smith aficionados who have created Venture Smith Day, and there's a whole industry. So you befriend those people, you read their books, you read the footnotes of their books, and then you soak all of that up, and then that leads you to it leads you deeper and deeper until you realize, okay, I don't think there's anything more here that I can find on that one, and so you just kind of start stitching it together.
What was so cool about this book, though, is that these 6 stories, they bump into each other. And you write, and later on at the end of the book, I believe when you were talking to someone, you asked, what religion do you practice? And they said, I practice Red Lake's religion, which you had written about. And you talked about that warm glow that historians get. So you choose this figure, Venture Smith, and you're writing about him. And then you find that Washington was in the same town at the same day. Washington's 6'4", Venture Smith 6'2", average colonist probably like 5'6", 5'7". They might have made eye contact, right? When that happens, do you get what is that serendipity?
Yeah, this gets back to that same notion of, this was a very unusual book for me, and I think it's just overall it's kind of an unusual book in that I selected these 6 people. And then I'm following their lives to see, out of my own curiosity, to see how does it feel, these forces, and they're going to feel very different from someone who was born in West Africa, from someone who was born outside of London, and you're trying to make sense of those things, and the way it all comes together is going to be, you hope, a surprise, and there are going to be moments that excite you, where you see. So I didn't know, superficially, there were very few contacts. There's never a time when all 6 of them sit and have dinner together or anything like that. So most of that, but I write, I'm a storyteller, I'm a writer, and I want to give a satisfying experience. So I sort of massaged them together at times. Like I found, for example, this moment when Washington and Venture Smith were in the same spot, in the same room. But and then I spent some time, wasted a couple of weeks looking to see if there was any indication that they'd actually met. just making that connection the way you just did, saying, they could have, because of their height, they could have seen each other over the crowd. You're hoping that is enough for the reader to get you through to the next, okay, you keep turning the page, and because you want to give a satisfying experience. You want the reader at the end to feel, this worked, this did that for me as a book. So there are a few, and Washington is the one that kind of connects most of the others. He and Margaret Moncrief have this remarkable interaction when she's about 15 years old. So I keep going back to saying it's an experiment because, we were just talking at dinner, the book was just optioned for a potential TV series. And option doesn't mean that's happening next week. It means maybe if they raise the money, blah, blah, blah. But what these producers told me is they like the idea that all these paths aren't going to cross. That, and they wanted to find in a screenplay way, find ways to do that same suggesting. That it's a more, it's a subtle form of storytelling.
We had many book club, 3 in Salisbury, 1 in Cornwall, where everybody read Revolution Song. We had some really terrific discussions about it. And one thing that stood out to me in thinking back on those sessions is that the most discussion was about Margaret Moncrief and about Venture Smith. So if we want to dig deeper into the book now, and particularly about Venture Smith, and you depict Connecticut's Venture Smith as a capitalist, as an entrepreneur, a farm owner, an investor in a whaling vessel, a very complicated narrative of the life of a Black American in the time of the Revolution. And I wonder, to what degree should we see the Venture Smith story as a unique story? Or to what degree should we see it as a story that's representative of the opportunities and the possibilities of the post-revolution world?
Yeah, so that gets at this notion. I said from the start I wanted it to be a diverse cross-section of characters, but that doesn't mean I want to, each one to tell the sort of to embody the cookie cutter notion of what it meant to be Black at the time of the Revolution or whatever. Because ultimately, if you're focusing on an individual, whoever it is, they're an individual and they don't fit the stereotype. So in Venture Smith's case, as we were saying earlier today when we were with the students, in selecting him, there are a number of what are called slave narratives. And so I originally thought, I'll just read through all the slave narratives and pick one of them. But most of them have this kind of formula to them because they were processed by abolitionist leaders who interviewed slaves and then told their story in the first person, but they did it in this kind of homogenized way. They sort of flattened. It doesn't feel like the real person. Venture Smith was very different. As you said, he gets out of slavery, buys himself out, and then he works like a dog and buys out his wife and children from slavery. And he's really, he's all about money, really. And so he's this man of substance in East Haddam, Connecticut, and near the end of his life, he finds a newspaper editor and sits him down and says, I want to tell my story, you write it down. And when you read his narrative, it feels different. It feels like this individual. So no, he's not a typical person, a typical Black man of that period. But I don't know that anybody would be. And it's, and to me, that was all the more exciting, the fact that he managed to do these remarkable things and had land, and for a time he bought slaves. But he didn't necessarily buy them for the reason you think he did. He thought he was helping them. He was giving them a way to earn their freedom. And then they run off on him. And then he's like, you can almost see him saying, well, now I kind of get what these white slave owners feel like, you know? It's like, what's the thanks I get, you know?
I love the part where they escapes from Fisher's Island with one of the guys who's a drunk. He's like, this guy's gonna get me caught. And he like turned himself back in. Like, there's a real pragmatism.
Yeah. So yeah, it's an individual.
I wonder if we can follow up on that pragmatism. Many people have read the book, but not everybody's read the book. We get a real insight into the complexity of it all in Venture Smith's, the forced decision about whether he should use his money to purchase his wife's freedom or his child's freedom. And I wonder if you could just elaborate on that.
Yeah, well, so just to back up, Venture Smith Brotier was his name in Africa. His father was a tribal elder, and they were attacked. The village was attacked by another African tribe, and he watched his father be tortured and die rather than tell where his money, his fortune was. And you can just see him, and this is him as an old man now, telling this story to this newspaper person. You can see in him, and then you see throughout his life, the money mattered. Money was, that was honor, that was manhood, and he kind of learned that lesson from watching his father die rather than reveal where his money was. And so then he has these decisions about who, and he's very practical. I'll buy this one out first because then they can work harder and make more money with me. And so he's making calculations all the time.
I love that his story starts in Africa too. That part is missing in a lot of them. I know some of my African students call him Brotier. They never call him Venture. The title, Revolution Song. Pete, you had in your head, what did you think it followed it?
I have this memory that the book was Revolution Song, a hymn in 6 parts, but I don't think it was.
So explain the title. Well, I just thought that it is kind of a song with 6 voices singing it. That was my notion. I try to make titles simple because I wrote a book called The Island at the Center of the World, and people say, "Oh, I love that book, the island in the middle of the earth, and the island in the universe." So then I wrote a book called Amsterdam. So Revolution Song was my idea, trying to be compact, but be a little bit poetic.
The American Revolution is often told from a familiar, heroic angle. And I wonder what aspect of the American Revolution you were most interested in challenging or complicating while you were writing this
I think
song.
what you just said, the idea that it was this heroic action. I mean, of course it was, but it wasn't just that. And people, I have lived my whole life kind of not aware of the forces of history until recent years. And suddenly, we all feel like, where are we going? What is happening? And so, as a writer of history, the periods I focused on, the people I focused on in the past, have tended to be eras where the forces of history were really, like the waves were really sloshing around you. And now, I think we get what that feels like. That uncertainty, that queasy feeling. We don't know where we're gonna be a year from now, or let alone 10 years from now. And that's what was the case then, during the revolution. Of course, nobody knew what the outcome would be. Nobody knew that the colonies were gonna be victorious. And there's you sometimes hear the statistic that it was like a third of the people were patriots, a third were loyalists, and a third were, please just let this go away. And so again, with these 6 people, they are approaching it from different backgrounds. And the reason I wanted to do From Birth to Death was I was attracted to the idea of a big event like the American Revolution is an event in someone's life. And it's maybe to them not as big an event as the birth of their children or, other things like that. So I like the idea of we see it, we're following their lives, and we see it building, and we know something's happening, and we, of course, know what's coming, but they don't, and we see it move through them, and it maybe shifts them in a dramatic way, or maybe not so much. And then it passes, that wave passes, and they are now on a different shore. They're in a different place because of that. And we see them out, live out the rest of their life like that. So I was more interested in looking at it in that way, in that kind of lived experience way, than in the heroic thing, or we all have to look at it this way because that way we feel proud and we can march forward as good citizens. Or, not that there's anything wrong with that, but that wasn't what I was after.
Yeah, I'd love to follow up talking about perspective on the past with something that you said last night. And last night you said that we often approach the revolution from the lens of the present. We look back to the causes of the revolution, through our present day eyes. And you said that it's a much different story if you start from before the revolution. If you start in Dutch Manhattan, or you start in Plymouth or in Jamestown, and look at the coming of the revolution from that side, from that perspective. And I wonder if you could say, what does the revolution look like if you change to that perspective?
Yeah, what I was talking about was most people, of course, if you think about the American Revolution or the Civil War or any event, you start now and you look back. But most of my career writing books, I've been focused on the 1600s, starting with the island at the center of the world and the Dutch founding of New Amsterdam, the colony of New Netherland, and the Puritans and the Pilgrims. And I've also written quite a bit about events in Europe in the 1600s. So I came, and I think what I started to do in the back of my mind, having been steeped in that world, was I slowly kind of moved forward, decade by decade, from the 1600s into the 1700s. And this is really how I came up with the idea of this book. It was kind of like, well, what would you, because in the 1600s, let me back up. The period of Jefferson and Adams and Hamilton, these people were steeped in the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment, and they create the American Enlightenment, and these concepts of individual liberty and sovereignty. That originates in Europe in the 1600s, especially in the Dutch Republic, which I spent a lot of time writing about, and that comes out of a lot of things. It comes out of the Protestant Reformation, where people suddenly want to have this personal relationship with God, not mediated by the Catholic Church, so it emphasizes individuals. And in the Netherlands in particular, this is a landscape that was settled much later than the rest of Europe, because it's basically a vast river delta. It's unstable, things flood. So when people did settle there, they built dams and dikes to control the land, and when they did that, they created new land, and they gave out parcels of land to everybody in the community, and they made money from it, and then they got wealthy, and they realized they could make life better for their children than it had been for them, which is very different from what was going on in the rest of Europe in the Middle Ages, where you had a feudal system, and you're just locked into your slot in things. So that then empowers individuals. And then as you move forward a couple of centuries, you have this society with these empowered individuals who are looking for opportunities, who are entrepreneurs, who are sending ships to the East Indies and so on. And all of that then reaches kind of an intellectual head with the figure of Spinoza, who is this Dutch Jew, born and raised in Amsterdam, who looks at this society. Now we're now in the midst of what's called the Dutch Golden Age, and he sees these powerful individuals, and he starts to craft a philosophy based on this notion of the individual. So it's not, truth is not received, it's not whatever the church says or whatever the king says. It's, there's something special in me, there's something unique in me, and if it's so special and unique in me, it must be in you too, and it has to do with reason, my ability to reason, and therefore, surely the only just society is one in which everybody has an equal say in forming a government. So he writes a philosophy based on this. puts it in a book. The book is banned immediately. Because it's banned, everybody wants to read it. So it spreads like wildfire in Europe. And this then seeds the European Enlightenment over the course of the next century. So this is very long-winded, but moving from the 1600s then into the 1700s, I was very interested in how those feelings, those ideas about individual liberty, even the 1640s, people in Europe, some people, were starting to say, well, doesn't that mean girls have just as much right to education as boys, you know? And so seeing these ideas develop, and so then you get people like John Locke, this notion of this political philosophy developing. And so it becomes quite mature, but nobody had yet actually tried to put it into practice and say, no, let's form a whole government based on this. And so then, you know, so here we are coming up into the 1700s, the mid-1700s, we go through the French and Indian War, and we're in the 1760s, and how are these people, who've lived this, George Washington, born in 1732, he's the third generation, I think, American, wants to be a planter, is a proud British subject, wants to be, above all, wants to be an officer in the British Army. He's denied that. And then as a planter, he finds life more and more difficult because of these different taxes that the home country is imposing. And you see him having these ideas in the back of his mind about individual freedom and empowerment, struggling with trying to be a good British subject, but he's foiled in terms of his manhood. This, you know, no, you're only a colonial. We're not going to make you an officer. You can be an officer in the Virginia militia, which to him was, you know, third rate. And then you see him economically hamstrung, and he's kind of forced into this. So with each of them, in very different ways, I wanted to show how these forces, you know, move through their life and then cause them to act in certain ways.
The natural segue, I think, from that will be the guy who surprised me the most. The first time I read the book, I've read it once and listened twice, and I'm obsessed. The first time I read it, I didn't like Abraham Yates. He annoyed me. But like listening to you just talk right now, like the student of the Enlightenment actually in a lot of ways was Yates. And every time
of these six people, yeah. So Abraham Yates, for those of you who haven't read the book, is he, and I have to credit Stefan Belinsky, a great historian of Albany, who died recently. When I was trying to put together the idea of the book, I talked to him and I said, Steve wrote he created a website called The People of Colonial Albany, and Steve Belinsky himself was a real kind of man of the people sort of historian, and you can still go to The People of Colonial Albany and it'll connect from one to another. And I said, is there someone in that world who would be a good person, who would fit in some interesting way here? And he pointed me to Abraham Yates, who was, as I said, he was the son of a blacksmith. He was a shoemaker and a merchant, and so he was a real kind of street level guy, but he was absorbed by these ideas of the Enlightenment. And he read John Locke, and he was a very early proponent of we have to break with England. He stayed local, you know, he stayed in Albany, but then as events progress, he becomes, he's on every committee in the colony of New York, and he's one of the fomenting for rebellion, and then he's actively participating not as a soldier but as at the political level. He's machinating, and then the revolution. Then they win the war, and he immediately turns. And this is something that we kind of lose sight of, the anti-federalists. And because what they start to do is they want to create a federation of the, you know, this is called the United States. The idea was they were still sovereign states, and Abraham Yates is someone who took that idea seriously. No, we should not, if we put all these states together, we're going to end up with a king. We're going to end up with a tyrant, and people are tittering. I'm not, but I mean, Abraham Yates was very. He saw, you know, he saw what was in people, as did George Washington. By the way, Washington in his farewell address warned people about the dangers of political parties, that they're going to, you know, we created this system of government where you have checks and balances, but political parties could just trample all over that.
The story is obviously about 6 characters, but I think if there was a 7th character, it would probably be New York City itself. There's, we've said these 6 never got together, but if they did, it would probably have been in New York City. And I'm wondering, when we think of the revolution, we think of Boston, we think of Philadelphia, to a lesser extent we think of Charleston. So I guess I have 2 questions, which is one, why is New York such a special place in the revolution? And why has that special role been forgotten?
Yeah. That's. I mean, I guess I have a bias because I've written so much about New York City, but I think I've written about it because it's underappreciated for its role, not just in the revolution, but in American history. I mean, I was just with taking a reporter for the New York Times. We were walking around the financial district, which used to be New Amsterdam. We're standing at Wall Street and Broad. Behind you is Federal Hall, where Washington was inaugurated, and with the big statue of him. Just to your right on the corner is the New York Stock Exchange. So it's the first center of American politics. It's the center of American capitalism. It's called Wall Street. Is the Dutch built the wall? Much of this comes from the Dutch. The Dutch brought pluralism. There were 18 languages spoken when there were only about 500 people there. So New York was New York even before it was New York. They brought relative tolerance, and with them they brought this notion of capitalism, which they had been pioneering in Europe at the same time. So it is no accident that that street that was their boundary, Wall Street, a century later becomes the place where this trading of stocks is going on, and where a stock exchange then is formed. And then you're looking down Broad Street, which is so called because the Dutch had a canal there, and then once they paved it over, it was the broadest street. And you look to your right, there's Trinity Church, and all the history that represents. That little triangle of land is so evocative of so much history. And you see, I've been there a million times, and you always see tourists wandering around kind of dazed, understandably, because it's like, where do I begin? You know, what can I focus on here? But so yeah, I think that's an epicenter, and it has to do with geography. So during the Revolution, and this factors into the book, the first flashpoint is New York City, where the Washington and his army are desperate to defend Manhattan Island. The British are desperate to get it, and this is partly the strategy of George Germain, who we haven't talked about, one of the characters in the book, who ran the war for England from London. And his strategy was, take Manhattan, cut off the Hudson, you'll split the colonies in 2, and the war will be over. They did take Manhattan, but it didn't transpire that way. So yeah, in terms of geography too, Manhattan Island has this centrality.
And why do you think the special role has been forgotten?
I think it has to do partly with the fact that New York was New Amsterdam, and it was Dutch, and because it was Dutch, it was always a mix of different people. Boston was pure, it had this identity. Connecticut, New England, I mean, these places had a more centralized identity. The very fact that New York had this multifarious nature made it harder to tell its own story. It made it harder for people to agree, and you see that play out during the Revolution. There was such a strong loyalist presence as well as patriot presence, and you see it play out during the Civil War when there was this movement in New York to break away and be its own thing, not North or South. So New York's story is always hard to tell, but flip that around. Okay, this is a place, the origins of capitalism, of tolerance, of multi-ethnicity. Well, you could say that's America. That's the American story too. It doesn't have the same kind of sheen that the story, if you focus on Philadelphia, doesn't have that same kind of heroic gloss, but maybe it's more real.
I think watching the Ken Burns documentary, one of the things I loved were the maps. And the maps always made sure it had the indigenous areas where they were occupying at the time. And as, growing up in Connecticut, native Connecticut, the revolution was something that happened in Plymouth and Massachusetts and from the shoreline of Connecticut. And you tell a much more dynamic, much more complex story. Just like you don't understand America unless you get that puzzle piece of the Dutch between the Connecticut River and the Chesapeake. Now that once that puzzle piece fit, once you realize that you had a story, tell us to the process of how you went from there to getting to the island. Find it. So you heard about this archive, this Dutch archive. And
you're now backing up to
island in the center of the world because we're on the Dutch. Okay. I'm sorry, but the Dutch.
Okay.
I think
we're switching books.
We're switching books for a second because it is this dynamic world, and one of the places we live, Salisbury, Connecticut, is part of Livingston Manor. Like it's part of the Dutch. You go to the 44 Bridge, the graveyard there. There's Dutch names in that graveyard. So it is a revolution song. So like, I feel like when looking, what I loved about your book, what I loved about the Ken Burns documentary, it's not just the English and the colonists. Like it's much more dynamic. So I guess thanks for adding that to the dialogue. But when you saw that, did you know that was a book?
Island at the Center of the World.
Yeah.
We're talking about. Okay, so that book, for those of you who haven't read it, is...
We were warned that some people might not have read the book. Pete and I are high school history teachers. That's a new world for us. We're not...
That's about it tells the story of the 40-year history of the Dutch settlement of New Netherland, which, the boundaries were always shifting, but it encompassed all parts of New York, some of Connecticut, New Jersey, some of Pennsylvania, some of Delaware. And in fact, going between here and Troutbeck, which I did several times today, you're crossing back and forth over the line that Peter Stuyvesant, the last director of the colony, negotiated that boundary. which shifted a bit since, but so that is a very central piece of not just New York's formation, but American formation. That's what I tried to argue in that book. And because of that, New York becomes a different place when you move forward into the next century. If you're asking about the impetus for that book, this is going back 25 years or so. I was living in the East Village of Manhattan, and I was taking my daughter to the nearest space she could run around and play, which was the churchyard of St. Mark's in the Bowery, and Peter Stuyvesant's tomb is there. And I was sort of impressed by my own ignorance of the Dutch period. I knew Peter Stuyvesant was associated with New Amsterdam, and I knew he had a wooden leg, and I didn't know anything else. So I asked some historian friends, historians of New York, who didn't, and I was amazed that they didn't know anything about the Dutch period. And then eventually somebody pointed me to Charles Gehring, who started in 1974 translating the 12,000 pages of records of the Dutch colony. And I called him, and we had a series of phone calls, and they were just completely disorienting to me in a really good way, where, and I at some point said to him something like, I've always thought of this story as beginning in Boston, the Pilgrims, the Puritans, but are you saying you could just as easily tell the story of how America got going from Lower Manhattan? And he said, yeah, that's what I've been trying to tell people since 1974. So I eventually then decided I would write a book on that, and he and Yanni Venema, this historian who worked with him translating, invited me. They gave me my own space in their corner of the State Library in Albany, and showed me how to make my way around Dutch handwritten 17th century documents, and they just, I would never have even thought to write the book without them. So it relied on these translations, and then my most recent book, which came out last year, Taking Manhattan, is kind of a sequel to that, because I realized in the past few years that the translation effort, which is still going on, had gotten to the last couple of years in the life of the colony, when we see New Amsterdam as this thriving place with, these traders, really bold people. I mean, imagine they're sending ships out to the Caribbean, to South America, to West Africa, to different parts of Europe, and it's suddenly this thing that the English are belatedly saying, oh, this is kind of interesting. So I thought, oh, that in itself is a good topic, and it's a really, Aristotle's notion of a story of, it should be a set number of characters, a set period of time, control those factors. So that this is a 2-week period in the late summer of 1664. You've got the whole town of New Amsterdam, which is about 1,500 people, but you've got then mainly you've got Peter Stuyvesant and Richard Nichols, who's sitting on the ship in the harbor at anchor on behalf of the English with this commission to, his ships are full of gunpowder and he's got soldiers and he's ready to open fire, but something else happens, and that something else is why I wrote the book. That's what it's about. It's a really interesting, I might almost call it a study in leadership between these two guys and the people around them. And what they end up doing is New York. They give birth to New York.
And Connecticut helped midwife that.
That's right. Yeah, John Winthrop, governor of Connecticut, played a crucial role because he was someone Stuyvesant trusted. And he plays this, and very dramatically, right when they're about to open fire on one another, he comes out in a little rowboat waving a flag. And I mean, it's like if you're going to make a movie about that, there's a scene.
That's why we should be Yankee fans in Connecticut.
That's right. I think we're probably getting close to the end of our time. I'd like to ask one more question. And as much as we love your work, and Rhonan and I have been pestering you for 2 days with questions about small time, which we really love. We're here tonight, of course, because it's 2026, and we're approaching rapidly the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and I want to do what good teachers do and borrow a question from one of my students this afternoon, which is, in an ideal world, what does that commemoration of America 250 look like?
You mean what kind of parties do you have?
What should we remember? How should we remember it?
Well, I think we, for the longest time, we insisted, in the way we grew up reading these textbooks that insisted on seeing these figures in our history as these great superheroes, and ignoring the ugly side of it. Then I'd say over the past 10 years or more, things swung the other way, and any founding father was a slave owner, forget about him, take down the statue, and So I think to be, not just to understand history, but just to be a mature adult human being, you have to be able to take in and hold two contradictory notions in your head at the same time. Yes, George and Martha Washington owned 300 slaves at Mount Vernon, and yes, he did he made this incredible personal journey, and while, and this isn't me saying this, a lot of historians of the Revolution say he was not a great general, but nevertheless, he did enough right things to pull this whole thing together, and so that this group of people, for the first time ever, enacted what Spinoza, more than a century earlier, had said, here's the kind of government you ought to have. I mean, you have to, so I think this commemoration, this celebration, ought to, really honor and be proud of that, while also acknowledging, that slavery was baked in, and that we've never, the Civil War, basically, the Civil War was a failure because it never resolved what it was meant to resolve, and we're still living with all of that. All of that is where we are right now.
Before we turn over to the audience, just again, what a good template, what a good blueprint to show us the complexity that is America in the Revolution's time, and we're certainly living through that complexity now. So thank you very much, Professor Shorto.
There you are.
Thank you for the book. I kept every page saying, what? So you've talked about venture, you've talked about...
Can you maybe hold the mic closer?
Oh, anyway, could you talk about Mary?
Margaret Mokriski?
Yes, because she was so different than the other characters.
Yeah.
Thank you.
She was the daughter of a British officer. She was a teenager when the war broke out, and he was in the orbit of Washington, the American Army, and apparently surprised some of them by siding with the British. So suddenly she's the daughter of a British officer, and he then, as I was saying, I was talking about how Manhattan becomes the first point of contention. So Washington and his officers, the American Army, they're clustered in Manhattan Island trying to figure out how to keep it, and the British are building their force in Staten Island, and they're going to invade. And she is about 15, and she's caught now. Her father's in Staten Island, and she's caught with the American officers, and they're all known to her because, you know, her father and everything. And she's being a proud British officer's daughter. She's suddenly decided this. And so there's this remarkable scene we were talking about at dinner where there's a toast to Washington, and she refuses to toast him, you know. So she's this very defiant girl, which sets the tone for what she's going to be through the rest of her life. So she has this very dramatic life of highs and lows. She marries this man who is clearly abusive, and then she just leaves him, just walks out and leaves him, and then goes on. So the American Revolution, she's someone who the American Revolution completely changes her whole life, but she's not, you know, a soldier. She's not part of it in the way you normally think of. But then most of her life transpires in London and in Paris, and she is, having left her husband, she has decided, and from our perspective, she's trying to make it on her own, which was impossible for a woman at that time. But what she does is she attaches herself to a powerful man who keeps her around for a while and then discards her, and she's pregnant. So then she has a baby, and then she attaches herself to another powerful man and keeps her for a while, and then she's pregnant, she has another baby, and so her life is getting more and more complicated, and she has this ideal for herself. She's a society person, and so you see her now. We're you know, thousands of miles from the American Revolution. The American Revolution is a thing of the past, but she's still struggling in a very. This gets back to what we were saying about Venture Smith and all the others. How these forces washed through her, completely redirected her, and then I just was really entranced with the idea of, I want to follow her to the end. You know, she's in debtor's prison with her babies. You know, used to have debtor's prison in England. So she becomes this incredibly sad figure, and you might say it's all because of the American Revolution.
Enjoyed your book, but I have a question about why you picked the Seneca leader, corn planter, when you might have picked Red Jacket, or you might have picked the Iroquois leader,
You mean Joseph Grant?
Grant. And so I was puzzled. Was it because it fed in more with your dialogue and the ups and the downs? I mean, these were very tragic. Both of them all three of them were very tragic. So I was very curious why you did that.
Another aspect of this, as I said, this is like doing a puzzle and there was no formula or anything. But another aspect of this, as with Venture Smith and with Margaret Moncrief, was, I mean, I'm going to spend years with these people, and they had to excite me. They had to be someone who I mean, if I feel that, then I have some chance of transmitting it on the page. And Corn Planter, his story, the contradiction that he embodied or that he had to live through. You know, when the Haudenosaunee nations, they have this huge, almost civil war over how do they respond to this struggle. And Joseph Brandt is saying we have to side with the British because they have this empire that stretches all over the world. And then when they defeat the Americans, we'll be in good shape. And Cornplanter in these meetings says, look, this is a family quarrel. This is like father and son fighting, Britain and their American colonies. We have to stay out of it. We don't have a part of it. He was overruled. And then having been overruled, he leads in battle on behalf of the British. So he didn't want to do this, but he's tenacious, he's a warrior, and he does his best, and he's vicious. And then the Americans win. And then he has to go to Washington and meet with him and somehow say, well, sorry about that, but how can you work with me so that I can ensure a future and can ensure a future for my people? I mean, that's such a trajectory. And then you work in his family and all these, all those. I just found it, very compelling.
I've been to several of the discussions, and this is the first time that anybody has mentioned George Germain. And he struck me as being the real villain from the British side, and we never hear about it. George III is the villain. From a historian's perspective and from your perspective, should we emphasize the villainy of Germain as well as the fact that he wasn't very good at his job?
Sarah, this woman had a question, just so you know, up here. So George Germain ran the war for England. Maybe he was a villain, but I just thought he was a great, again, he completely captured me, and I had never heard of him. And he ran the war for England. He was the Secretary of State for the American Department. So we're going to war? Okay, well, he's the one that has to carry this out. He was an incredible force of nature kind of personality. He was from the aristocracy. His house, Knoll House, which still exists, was what's called a calendar house. So it had 12 doorways to represent the 12 months, 7 courtyards to represent the 7 days of the week, 52 staircases to represent the number of weeks in the year, and 365 rooms. And he was a teenager before he was comfortable like roaming around the house without getting lost. So I mean, incredible privilege and all that. And then
Mentored by Jonathan Swift.
Yes,
Yeah.
right. Mentored by Jonathan Swift. And so then he, as a young man in war, because he's this martial kind of guy, he engages in what is felt to be this act of cowardice, holding back in battle. And yet he overcomes that and rises in politics, and has his enemies, and his enemies ever after are accusing him, calling him the coward of Minden, where this battle took place. And so he has that, and this, I kind of speculate that, and it's not just me speculating, that this, you're interested in the psychology of your characters, and he always had to try to overcome this and never could, this stain on his character. So when the Americans rebel and he's going to be the one to figure out, all right, what's our strategy here? He's the kind of the force behind this notion of we're going to hit them hard, we're going to hit them quick, we're going to take Manhattan, we're going to cut off the Hudson River, and they're going to come, groveling to us. And it didn't happen, and that got him. And then everybody in Parliament is saying, the coward of Minden, look where you got us, So again, this great personality, great figure, and villain, yes, but I just think a great character.
First of all, I did read the book, The Island. The Island at the Center of, and as a native Manhattanite, it was absolutely fascinating because we didn't really appreciate just how much the Dutch had really influenced New York. Along my way, I think I read that the Dutch traded Manhattan for Guyana in South America, and I have good friends from there. I think it's a true thing, or at least one of the elements. The third geographical thing, and then I have a question, is I served in the Peace Corps in Ghana, so I've been to the forts, I've been back a couple of times. It's so wonderful to see the black aspect of the Revolutionary War, which is never told. And then my question is, tomorrow is No King's Day. Would you like to speak to that?
Well, I believe in the right to protest, so certainly I think that's in a long, noble tradition. And I'll just, if I may correct you, no, they didn't trade Manhattan for Guyana. Some people often think that they traded it for Suriname, but in fact that's not true either. This takeover by the British happens in 1664. This was one of a number of trade wars between the English and the Dutch. And at the end of them, what they would do when they were exhausted, from blasting away at each other all over the world, their negotiators would meet and they would settle accounts. And the negotiators met in 1667 in the Dutch city of Breda, and this was the era of colonialism, and these European countries are taking possessions all over the world and taking them from each other. So in these negotiations, they basically drew up 2 columns of properties and saying, these we'll give back, these we won't give back. Manhattan was basically in one column. New Netherland was in one column. Suriname was in another. So it wasn't a one-to-one swap. They were all part of this global negotiation and peace treaty.
More on No Kings.
More on No Kings. What do you want me to say?
Another revolution.
He wants a revolution.
Very emotionally moved by my visit to Washington's headquarters in Beacon. And does your book touch on that period when Washington was in Beacon?
I don't think I have it. Do I? Yeah, I looked at Rhonan because he said he read it 3 times, and I haven't read it. I haven't read it in a while. It's cover a lot of winters. Yeah, I don't think so.
Well, I recommend Beacon and to anybody who wants to know more about Washington. It was very moving to visit his headquarters, where he lived.
Would you care to comment on, portray from a historian's point of view, the current struggles in this country and the things that are going on, including the foreign influences that you talk about in New Amsterdam, people with 18 different languages, and today the United States is open. Anybody really can play in politics with their money, they find ways, and talk about how someone like you that looks to documents, looks to personalities, looks to the complexities, the contradictions, would talk about the current era, which seems to be one of cowardice.
Yeah, well, I recently was in Amsterdam, and a big corporation asked me to come and give a keynote, and what they wanted me to do was explain to these European clients of theirs what's going on in America. And I said, well, I'm not going to do that, but what I could do as a writer of history is show how these forces that seem, especially to Europe, like what is going on? We thought we knew who America was as our partner. What happened? So what I tried to show was that these forces go all the way back as part of American history. So I talked about Richard Nichols and Peter Stuyvesant in Manhattan. Nichols represented one faction of English society. The other faction was the Puritans, who had recently been in power, who had this theocratic notion of themselves and of history and of government. And the Puritans, even though the King of England was in power again in England, the Puritans had their colonies in New England. And so Richard Nichols had 2 missions. One was to take Manhattan from the Dutch, and the other was to go to Boston and to the Puritan leaders there, who were very powerful, and force them, get them to say, yes, we bow down to the king. We're not going to follow the path that led to the English Civil War. Nichols succeeded in this brilliant way in creating New York, and creating it in a way that maintained from the Dutch period this relative tolerance, this outward-looking, pragmatic, business-minded sensibility, and he failed utterly to deal with the Puritans. They basically told him to hit the road, and what that sets up is 2 centers of ideology in colonial America. The one, pragmatic, outward looking. The other, Christian first, and as we succeed, that means God is anointing us and our nation, and basically whatever we do is right because we have God on our side. And from the very beginning, those two forces, I think, have been there in American history. You see it through the Civil War. You see it in the 1920s. You see it in the 1920s when you had the return of the Ku Klux Klan, and because Americans were these proud Protestant nation, and over the recent decades they'd had all of these this massive influx of Southern Europeans, Catholics, who they were afraid of. So they didn't want Italians, they didn't want Irish, and the Prohibition is part of that too. Prohibition is this very Christian thing and the undercurrent to Prohibition was this anti-Catholic notion, because their logic was the Irish have their whiskey, the Italians have their wine, the Germans have their beer. So this is a way to kind of push them out and say, you're not wanted here. So you see it in the 20s, you see it after World War II, and you see it now. So these forces there's always been, in the period of the Revolution, there was, you had the story that Europeans buy about American history, and a lot of Americans do too, and rightly, is the Enlightenment story of these leaders who took these ideas about individual liberty, but also transpiring, and what maybe more people, ordinary Americans, believed in, was the religious story that said God wants us to rule this continent, give us dominion over these native people, and that becomes the notion of manifest destiny. We have the right to take over. So those things have always been there, and I think it's useful for us in trying to figure out how we're getting through this current moment to recognize that this has all somehow always been America, and we've maybe always been having two conversations that are on different levels and not really meeting up, but that's part of who we are.
Hi, loved your book. I actually borrowed it from my mother-in-law, who spoke just a few minutes ago. So you guys were talking about the perspective in history and how we always look back. And one of the things that you find when you look back is that things seem inevitable. And so I'm always interested in counterfactuals in history. So two that I think are interesting in this concept, or in this space, are: could there have been anything that the British have done to keep the Americans on side, a la Canada? And was there any way for the native peoples to come to an accommodation of the United States that didn't allow the white people to take over their territory?
I am always hesitant to address what-if questions, because I think then you're immediately in the realm of science fiction, But yes, of course things could have been different. As we were talking about Washington earlier, Washington desperately wanted to be a British officer. If they had given him a command in the British Army, I don't think he would have joined the other side. I think he would have been a British officer. How would that have changed things? So, it's like the butterfly theory. If a butterfly somewhere flaps his wings differently, then that has this ramifications, and all of history changes. So any number of things. Yes, they could have. I think someone recently has written a book about things that could have gone differently, and there would have been this alliance of Americans and Native Americans, and they would have found ways to cooperate. But as I say, to me, that's not the business I'm in.
Well, I haven't read your book, but I'm looking forward to it. And I have one, I'm fascinated with the disparate characters that you selected as the six whom you write about. The question is, were there any notable folks who ended up on the cutting room floor? And
sure, there were dozens of who I tried out, and there were various reasons for not including them. The most common reason being, as I said, we know a lot about this person's life and it's really fascinating, but only for a short period of time. And I wanted to know, so they just didn't fit my criteria. But as I said, Washington was the last one I selected, and I was going to pick Alexander Hamilton in that role. And this shows you how long ago I was working on this. It was before Hamilton came out. And at that time, if you recall, Hamilton was a kind of minor founding father. He wasn't given a lot of attention. So I thought, okay, I'll give him some attention, but I'm glad I didn't, because then, I would have been swept up in that deluge.
Thank you very, very much to Russell Shorto and to Peter and to Rhonan. Thank you also to all of you for being here, because without an audience we literally do not have a forum, so thank you so much for coming. If you have enjoyed tonight and have not read the book, or if you have friends and family who've not read the book, they are for sale outside by the library, so please avail yourselves of that. Our next forum event will be in April, and it is Professor Akil Reid Amar coming to speak again, so we're continuing the theme for CT250. He will be talking about the Constitution. Thank you also to those of you who generously donate and support us so that we can keep bringing these events to you for free to attend. And if you are so inclined, please continue to do that. Thank you for coming. See you next time.